The blood dripping onto the pristine penthouse marble isn't my husband's. It's mine. For 7 years, I played the silent, fragile human wife to the Alpha King so a syndicate wouldn't execute my sister. He thought he was protecting me. He had no idea I was the ex-military cleaner, slaughtering his enemies in the dark. But tonight, the cartel caught me. And my husband just found my sniper rifle. Chapter 1. Blood dried tight across her knuckles, flaking like rust, as she scrubbed her hands under the scalding tap. The rogue shifter's life swirled down the porcelain drain, mingling with cheap soap and grit. He brought silver into Torin's territory. Breaking the king's law meant a quick end in the damp alleys of the lower district, and she was the ghost who delivered it. Peeling off her ruined Kevlar felt like shedding a second skin. Her ribs throbbed from a brutal kick, a dull ache radiating through her side with every breath she drew. Dropping the gear onto the tile, she methodically ran an oiled rag over the receiver of her sniper rifle. The cramped bathroom reeked of burnt cordite and sharp metal. She slid the weapon into the biometric safe concealed behind rows of untouched stilettos, letting the steel bolt click shut. Silence rushed back into the room. Water dripped from the faucet, each hollow tap echoing against the tile. Dragging a silk slip over her battered shoulders, the cool fabric clung to blooming bruises. Staring into the mirror, the dead-eyed reflection staring back offered no comfort. Then a boot scraped against the floorboards out in the corridor. Torin. The floor vibrated beneath her bare feet. 7 years of marriage, and the sheer physical weight of his presence still made the air thin out. He was the Alpha King, a man built for war, and she played the role of his fragile human wife. Keeping him blind kept her captive, sister breathing. A debt collector owned her bloodline, and she sold herself to the court to buy time. Pressing her palm against the oak door, heat radiated through the grain. Pine needles and static ozone, the scent of a predator on the edge, seeped through the doorframe. She waited for the brass knob to turn, for him to finally push past the lies and rip her world apart. Instead, the floorboards groaned as he stepped away. The slow drag of his boots faded down the hall, her throat constricted, tasting like dry ash. She fought in the dark to keep his city clean, but the shadows were already wrapping around her ankles, dragging her toward the ledge.
Torin remained rooted to the carpet outside her suite, his claws biting into his own palms until the skin split. Sweet vanilla drifted under the door gap, but a copper tang laced the air. Fresh rust, city smog. He dragged a thumb over his aching eyes. The strain of keeping the territory intact was fraying his control. Putting distance between the wolf and the glass cage he built for her, he stepped back. He wanted to drag his human wife into his chest, to bury his face in her neck and block out the blood-soaked streets. But the phantom stench of his slaughtered pack clawed up his throat. Years ago, his arrogance cost his closest friends their lives. He wouldn't let the violent underworld touch Harper. His ribs expanded with a ragged exhale. The wolf inside him battered against his ribs, demanding to claim its mate, driving him to splinter the oak barrier. A mechanical vibration buzzed against his thigh, vibrating through his tailored slacks. The spell broke. Turning away, he let the quiet swallow the corridor as he marched toward the study. Marble cracked under his boots, the sharp sound echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Pushing through the frosted doors of his office, the atmosphere shifted to stale coffee and nervous sweat. Silas stood rigid by the mahogany desk. The beta's broad shoulders were tight, the muscle in his cheek jumping erratically. "We have a problem, Torin," Silas rumbled, the low pitch rattling a glass on the sideboard. "Spill it." Torin kept his voice flat, a low hum of warning. "The Obsidian Syndicate." Silas slid a stack of surveillance prints across the polished wood. They're moving on the southern docks tonight, cutting our supply lines. Golden light flared in Torin's peripheral vision. The syndicate dealt in illegal silver and dark blood magic. Silas tapped the top photo. New leader in town. Worse, they have the patrol schedules. Someone close is feeding them intel. Torin's fingers curled over the edge of the mahogany desk. The wood groaned, then violently cracked, splintering into jagged shards under his grip. Dust motes drifted through the sudden quiet. The broken wood settled onto the rug with a soft rustle. A mole, operating inside his own walls. The rot had already crossed his threshold, and Harper was sleeping just down the hall.
A harsh vibration rattled the bed frame, jarring Harper from her hollow thoughts. She lunged for the burner phone hidden beneath her mattress. The stark blue glare illuminated the dark room, casting sharp shadows across her cheekbones. Target confirmed. Syndicate leader at the southern docks. Midnight. 1 million bounty. The air rushed out of her lungs. The syndicate boss. The man holding her sister's iron-clad debt. If she put a bullet in his skull tonight, the chain broke. 7 years of lying to Torin, scrubbing blood from her cuticles, and burying her conscience. Done. The screen faded to black, leaving the room plunged in pitch. She sat perfectly still, listening to the erratic thud of her own pulse drumming against her ears. Kicking the silk slip to the floor, she dragged the stiff Kevlar back over her ribs. The bruised muscle screamed in protest, a sharp spike of agony that anchored her to the present. She strapped a silver-laced combat knife to her thigh, the leather biting into her skin. Sliding a fresh magazine into the grip of her sidearm, the steel clacked into place, a cold mechanical click that sealed her fate. Crossing the bedroom to the balcony, she shoved the glass door open. Freezing wind slapped her face, reeking of exhaust and incoming rain. The city sprawled below, a grid of neon cuts and suffocating shadows. Stepping onto the slick concrete ledge, the 50-story drop pulled at her equilibrium. A single misstep meant joining the pavement. She threw one last glance over her shoulder, at the locked door. Torin was down the hall, wrapped up in his own violent war, completely oblivious to hers. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the wind snatching the words from her lips before they could land. Leaning forward, she let gravity pull her off the ledge, diving straight down into the neon abyss. Concrete rushed up to meet her boots before the grapple line snapped taut, swinging her directly into the salt-choked labyrinth of the southern shipping docks. Silver gunfire instantly tore through the fog. She slammed her shoulder against a rusted shipping container, fighting the sharp burn in her bruised ribs. Syndicate enforcers boxed her in. The ambush was entirely too perfect. Someone sold her patrol route to the cartel. She racked the slide of her handgun. Her pulse drummed against her teeth, driving out the rising panic. Growing up in the lower district taught her one brutal truth. Nobody rides to the rescue. You forge your own armor and claw your way out. Surrender wasn't an option. Her sister's life depended on her pulling the trigger tonight. A shadow vaulted the stacked crates. Claws scraped steel. Harper dropped to the mud, rolling under the lunging beast. She leveled the barrel and pulled the trigger 3 times. Gunfire cracked like thunder. The enforcer crashed into the puddles, violently kicking up black water before going completely still. Gunsmoke drifted through the damp air. Water dripped off the corrugated iron. The ringing in her ears drowned out the distant harbor sirens. Then her collarbone exploded. A sniper round from the loading crane punched straight through her Kevlar, burying toxic silver deep into her left side. Harper collapsed against the crate. Air punched out of her lungs in a wet gasp. The sheer burn of the metal paralyzed her nervous system. A tailored wingtip shoe stepped into her blurring line of sight. The syndicate boss. A silver flash drive clattered onto the wet asphalt. "You lose, little ghost," he sneered. And gritting her teeth against the spreading venom, her shaking fingers snatched the metal drive. She shoved it into her tactical rig. She absolutely refused to bleed out in this filth. Her trembling hand found the smoke grenade on her belt. She pulled the pin and dropped it. Grey fog immediately swallowed the alley. Stumbling blindly toward the city grid, she pressed a palm to her torn flesh. By the time she hauled herself into the penthouse's hidden service elevator, bright blood pooled around her boot treads. The steel doors slid shut, sealing her in a metal coffin as she dragged the wall right into Torrin's sanctuary.
Wood splinters still littered the study floor when the sterile penthouse air shifted. A copper tang cut straight through the filtered ventilation. Torrin stopped breathing. That wasn't random street violence. That was vanilla and ozone. Harper. He vaulted over the ruined desk, tearing down the marble corridor. His boots slipped on the polished stone as he took the corner toward the service wing. He skidded to a halt. Harper lay crumpled on the pristine tiles, a dark red smear trailing behind her boots. Torrin hit his knees. The impact cracked the grout. He reached out to pull his fragile wife to his chest, expecting the soft glide of her silk nightgown. His rough fingertips scraped against abrasive tactical plating. He froze. The hum of the climate control suddenly sounded deafening. Torrin stared at the blood-slicked Kevlar covering her chest. A matte black rifle hung off a sling. Silver-laced blades protruded from the sheaths on her combat boots. She reeked of burnt cordite and dead shifters. For 7 years, he kept her locked in a glass tower, thinking he was protecting a delicate human. Instead, she was out in the mud, butchering his enemies. Harper? His voice came out as a broken rasp. Her eyelids fluttered, glazed and unfocused from the silver poisoning. I tried to fix it, she choked out, a bubble of blood bursting on her lips. To pay the debt. Awe slammed into his ribcage. She didn't need a savior. She was a weapon. The guilt tasted like ash in the back of his throat. Like a boy trying to lock a wild hound in a tiny cage, he had trapped a fierce predator. The penthouse perimeter alarms shrieked. Crimson strobes slashed across the white walls. Silas rounded the far corner, chambering a round into a shotgun. They breached the lobby, Silas roared. Torrin ignored the beta. He slid his arms under Harper's ruined armor and lifted her. She weighed nothing. Hold on, he commanded, his chest vibrating against hers. He turned his back on the blaring sirens. Stepping over the threshold, he carried his lethal queen toward the underground bunker, while the elevator shafts echoed with ascending gunfire.
Red strobe lights pulsed against her closed eyelids as Torrin carried her deeper into the foundation of the tower. Concrete stairs rushed by beneath his rapid, punishing strides. The scent of wild pine anchored her fading consciousness. Despite the silver burning a hole through her torso, her grip tightened on her sidearm. Combat boots thundered on the steps right behind them. The cartel was closing the gap. Put me down, she wheezed, tasting iron. I can take the shot. You are done fighting tonight. Torrin kicked open the reinforced steel door of the panic room. He laid her flat on a freezing metal work table. The brutal chill shocked her nervous system, forcing her eyes wide open. 3 syndicate mercenaries flooded into the narrow corridor outside the bunker, assault rifles raised. Torrin didn't reach for a weapon. He threw himself into the doorway. Bones snapped and reformed with a wet, sickening crunch. Tailored fabric ripped to shreds as muscle expanded. There was no mystical glow, just the violent, agonizing biology of a true apex predator taking over. In a fraction of a second, a towering black wolf blocked the threshold. Silver fur bristled along its spine. The beast lunged. Gunfire erupted, but jaws clamped down on steel and flesh alike. The mercenaries never stood a chance. It was over in 3 savage strikes. Spent brass casings clinked against the concrete. Blood dripped slowly from the doorframe. The ventilation fan whirred in the sudden, absolute silence. The wolf turned. It padded back into the bunker, pushing the vault door shut with a bloody snout. The locking bolts slammed into place. Torin fell to his knees, his spine arching as the shift reversed. Dark fur receded into scarred bare skin. He stood up, chest heaving, dripping with cartel blood. He walked to the steel table. The gold in his irises burned bright in the dim emergency lighting. "You bled for my city," he rasped, staring at the ruin of her armor. "I couldn't let them hurt my family," she whispered back. He reached out, his thumb swiping a streak of grime from her cheekbone. The physical contact sent a jolt of pure static through her poisoned veins. Trapped in a concrete box, while the city burned above, the real war was the lethal magnetic pull threatening to completely drag her under. A curved steel needle punched through her flesh, dragging Harper violently back into consciousness. She gasped, her spine arching off the freezing metal cot as harsh fluorescent light blinded her. Silver venom still burned in her veins, but Torin wasn't relying on genetics to close the wound. He leaned over her trembling torso, methodically pulling black thread through her torn skin. The metal cot groaned under her shifting weight. A ventilation fan whirred steadily overhead, filling the quiet space between them. Harper expected fury. She had lied to the Alpha King for 7 years, hiding her lethal skill set and playing the role of a fragile human bride. Treason normally earned a quick execution on a cold floor like this one. Adrenaline spiked. She blindly reached for the tactical knife strapped to her thigh. Torin caught her wrist mid-air. His calloused fingers locked around her forearm, firm but holding back his crushing strength. "Stay down," he rumbled, the deep vibration echoing off the concrete walls. "You should be furious," she wheezed, tasting copper at the back of her throat. "I deceived you." He didn't argue. Tying off the medical suture, he snipped the thread with a pair of trauma shears. He finally looked up from her bleeding side, his golden irises locked onto hers. There was no feral anger burning in his stare. Instead, she found absolute, quiet reverence. "You are bleeding," Torin said softly, treating her name like a sacred vow. "We will talk later." Releasing her wrist, he stepped back. Harper let her head fall back against the hard table. Growing up in the lower districts taught her that weakness invited death, forging her survival instincts out of bitter necessity. She never wanted pity. Yet Torin wasn't offering pity, he was offering respect. Reaching out with a shaking hand, her knuckles brushed against his jawline. The rough stubble scraped her skin. Torin leaned into the touch, closing his eyes, as a ragged exhale escaped his chest. Despite the sudden warmth, a chilling reality snapped her focus back to the war. Someone inside the royal penthouse handed her patrol route to the syndicate. She had to identify the mole before the cartel turned this underground bunker into their tomb.
The acrid scent of ozone and buried secrets choked the cramped bunker. Torin paced the length of the room, his boots grinding concrete dust into the floorboards. He needed answers. Pivoting on his heel, he stopped at the foot of her medical cot. He crossed his scarred arms over his chest. "Tell me exactly what you do in the dark," he demanded, keeping his voice dangerously low. Harper pushed herself up onto her elbows, her chin lifted with absolute defiance. "I am a cleaner," she stated flatly. "I hunt the threats in your territory. I put 42 rogue shifters in the ground over the last 7 years." Torin stopped breathing. A water pipe dripped somewhere in the dark corner of the room. The rhythmic plink echoed against the tile. 42. His elite royal guard struggled to track 2 rogues a month, when the delicate wife he kept locked in a glass tower was a one-woman execution squad. She defended his crown with far more ruthless efficiency than his entire military force. Guilt slammed into his gut like a physical blow. He spent years assuming he carried the violence of the city alone, while she was bleeding out in the mud to keep his streets clean. Why? His voice cracked, the raw sound scraping his throat. Why didn't you just tell me? The syndicate holds my sister's debt. Her gaze never wavered. I made a vow to buy her freedom. The emotional distance between them shattered completely. Torin dropped to his knees on the hard floor. Reaching forward, he carefully took her cold fingers in his hands. He didn't care about the broken rules or the complex web of lies. He only cared about the lethal survivor bleeding on his table. Pressing a lingering kiss to her bruised knuckles, he looked up. You are never fighting alone again. A blaring siren violently shattered the quiet. Red strobe lights ignited across the bunker ceiling. Torin bolted upright, lunging toward the security console. Digital seismometers spiked wildly across the glowing monitors. The cartel wasn't retreating. They were actively drilling through the reinforced concrete ceiling directly above their heads. The silver flash drive she pulled from the alley had triggered a desperate siege, and their time was up.
Plaster dust fell from the vibrating ceiling, landing directly on Harper's face. She shoved herself off the cot. The fresh stitches instantly ripped at her skin, but she locked the pain in a mental box. Limping across the vibrating floor, she ripped open the wall-mounted trauma kit. She grabbed a glass vial of combat stimulants and an auto-injector. Torin grabbed her shoulder. "What are you doing? You are bleeding out." "I am surviving," she snapped. Jamming the needle straight into her thigh, she compressed the plunger. The chemical fire hit her bloodstream instantly. Her pupils dilated. The agonizing burn in her ribs faded to a dull, manageable throb as her heart rate skyrocketed. Pivoting away from him, she marched to the iron vault door of the armory. She punched the keypad. The steel bolts retracted, revealing a rack of high-tech ordnance. The familiar stench of gun oil and cold iron instantly grounded her racing pulse. Pulling 2 silver-plated rifles from the wall, she tossed one backward without looking. Torin caught the weapon against his chest. "Check your corners," Harper ordered, slamming a magazine into her own gun. "Load armor-piercing rounds. They'll drop through the ventilation shafts." The tension in the room snapped. A slow, predatory smirk curled the corner of Torin's mouth. He didn't argue. He didn't try to shove her behind a blast door to protect her. He racked the slide of his rifle, the metallic clack echoing sharply over the sound of the drills. The uneven dynamic of their marriage died right there on the concrete. They were no longer a king and his fragile pet. They were 2 apex predators backed into a corner. They're standing shoulder to shoulder with the alpha king, her grip tightened on the synthetic stock of her rifle. Power wasn't given. It was taken. A deafening crack split the air. A massive chunk of the ceiling caved in, crashing onto the metal table she was just lying on. The drilling ceased. The breach was open. Raising their barrels in perfect synchronization, they aimed into the dust cloud, entirely ready to burn the cartel to the ground.
Reinforced concrete shattered with deafening force. Jagged chunks of plaster crashed onto the metal work tables, kicking up a suffocating cloud of pulverized cement. 4 braided ropes dropped through the jagged breach, completely severing the fluorescent emergency lights. Syndicate enforcers slid down the lines, hitting the floorboards with military precision. Torin didn't force a full shift. He needed opposable thumbs for the trigger guard. Instead, he channeled the transformation directly into his hands. Bone cracked under his skin. Claws tore through his knuckles, locking his grip permanently around the synthetic stock of the rifle. He squeezed the trigger, unleashing a relentless spray of hollow point rounds into the settling dust. Gunfire hammered his sensitive eardrums. Spent brass casings rained onto the tile, pinging sharply over the chaos. Off to his right, Harper moved like liquid shadow. She ducked a volley of return fire, dropping onto one knee. Her sidearm barked twice. Two cartel shooters collapsed into the rubble, their throats entirely destroyed. The remaining enforcers scrambled backward, realizing they weren't just ambushing a king, but fighting a synchronized firing squad. The air scrubbers whined and died. Sparks showered from the ruptured ventilation duct. Acrid smoke and burning plastic sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Gunfire paused as the surviving cartel members took cover behind the debris. Dust drifted through the blinding strobe lights. Taurine choked on a lungful of bitter ozone. "Backup tunnels," he roared, the sound tearing his raw throat. Grabbing the back of her tactical vest, he hauled her toward the secondary vault. They slammed against the reinforced steel frame. The blast door was stuck, grinding harshly against bent tracks. Torin drove his bleeding shoulder into the metal, fighting for inches while bullets sparked off the plating dangerously close to his skull. Through the thick smoke, a red laser sight cut through the darkness, painting a dot directly onto Harper's chest as the door stubbornly refused to budge.
Showering sparks singed her bare arms as Harper shoved her boots against the floor grate, throwing her entire body weight against the jammed steel. With an agonizing screech of metal on metal, the locking bolts finally slammed home. The deadbolt engaged. Total darkness swallowed them. The muffled thud of cartel fists hammering against the exterior plating vibrated through the steel. Inside the tunnel, the only sound was the ragged, desperate drag of oxygen entering their lungs. Harper slid down the freezing door until she hit the grate. Her stitched side burned like a lit match inside her ribcage. Torin collapsed next to her. Sweat and pulverized concrete coated his skin. The stench of ozone and fresh blood rolled off his chest in waves. The sheer terror of the firefight rapidly mutated into something entirely feral. Her adrenaline demanded a physical outlet. Torin shifted closer, his broad shoulders boxing her into the corner. "Are you hit?" The vibration of his low rumble traveled straight through the metal floorboards into her spine. She couldn't find the breath to answer. She shook her head. The distance vanished. Torin bracketed her face with rough, bleeding hands, crushing his mouth against hers. It wasn't a gentle exchange. It was a desperate collision of teeth and bruised lips. Harper gripped his tactical harness, pulling him down, tasting salt and copper. Trapped in a pitch-black corridor, the suffocating claustrophobia broke. His thumbs mapped the line of her jaw, sliding down to trace the rigid plates of her Kevlar armor. Then a sharp edge dug into her hip bone. The drive. Ripping her mouth away, she gasped for air. Her fingers dug into her tactical pocket, pulling out the silver rectangle. The cartel's secret.
The taste of her blood still stained Torin's mouth when she pushed him back. His feral pupils slowly contracted in the gloom. Harper held up a small, silver rectangle, the metal catching the faint red glow of the tunnel's emergency strip lighting. "Where did you get that?" he asked, fighting to steady his breathing. "The cartel boss dropped it in the alley," she rasped. "We need a terminal." Torin hauled himself upright, his joints cracking in protest. He grabbed her hand, pulling her down the narrow corridor until they reached a rusted maintenance console bolted to the concrete. Harper jammed the drive into the auxiliary port. A cracked monitor flickered to life, casting a sickly green hue over their bruised faces. A single audio file populated the screen. She hit play. Static crackled from the blown speakers. Then, a voice filled the tunnel, deep, familiar, and dripping with contempt. "Silas. The human girl is useless," the recording of the beta sneered. "The Alpha King is blind. I am handing you the bunker codes. Kill Torin. I take the crown. The green light flickered. Torin's core temperature plummeted. The concrete walls seemed to warp. His oldest friend, his second in command. Silas sold them out for a throne. A second voice crackled through the static. And the cleaner's little sister? Moved to the abandoned train yard. Silas laughed. Use her as bait. If Harper lives, she'll run straight into the trap. Harper stopped breathing. An empty brass casing slipped from her boot tread, clattering loudly against the floor grate. The recording cut to dead air. Torin stared at the blank screen. Betrayal didn't leave him broken. It left him hollow, filling rapidly with a cold, absolute rage. He turned toward his wife. Her eyes were wide, terror finally cracking her stoic armor. Torin didn't offer comforting words. He turned toward the tunnel exit, his claws sliding out of his knuckles with a sickening scrape. They were done playing defense, unplaying.
The rusted deadbolt of the jammed blast door stood between Harper and her sister. Silas's recorded voice continued to echo in the claustrophobic space. Bait. The cartel was using her bloodline to set a trap. Panic threatened to paralyze her vocal cords. She shoved the terror into a mental lockbox, burying it deep beneath years of survival instincts. Dropping to the grated floor, she popped the latch on a green munitions crate shoved in the corner of the corridor. She pulled out 4 blocks of grey C4 putty. I am making us a door, she stated, ripping a copper blasting cap from her tactical rig. Torin knelt beside her. Concrete dust coated his scarred shoulders. That is unstable ordnance. It could collapse the entire tunnel. They have my sister. Harper's voice cracked, raw, and violently desperate. She jammed the detonator directly into the clay. I will tear this territory down to the bedrock to get her back. He didn't argue. He didn't issue an alpha command. Reaching out, Torin carefully took the wire cutters from her trembling fingers. Then we burn it together, he rumbled. Show me where to place the charge. They molded the explosives along the steel hinges, twisting the red and blue wires in perfect tandem. Setting the digital timer, Harper grabbed a black keycard off the floor, a cartel drop, and shoved it into her pocket without a second glance. Torin hauled her backward, shoving her behind an overturned steel workbench. The red digital numbers clicked to 0. Fire swallowed the corridor. The shockwave ripped the blast door completely off its tracks, launching them both into the blinding white noise of the explosion.
Searing heat rolled over the overturned workbench, carrying a lethal storm of jagged steel. Torin operated purely on instinct, throwing his body completely over Harper's frame before the blast wave hit. Shrapnel tore into his left shoulder. He bit back a roar as toxic silver pierced his muscle tissue. The metal burned like injected battery acid, immediately shutting down his genetic healing factor. Silence fell over the corridor, broken only by the hiss of melting plastic. Plaster dust drifted down from the cracked ceiling. The ringing in his eardrums slowly faded into the sound of Harper's frantic breathing. Torin pushed himself up on his good arm, tasting ash and copper on his tongue. Torin? Harper scrambled out from under him. Her face was coated in gray soot, but her hands were entirely steady. Ripping a strip of fabric from her tactical shirt, she immediately jammed it into his bleeding shoulder, packing the silver wound with brutal efficiency. I'm fine, he gritted out, though his pulse hammered erratically. The betrayal tasted worse than the blood. Silas manipulated the guard. If his beta was a traitor, the entire Royal Security Force was compromised. Harper's fingers slipped on his slick skin. A single tear cut a clean track down her ash-covered cheek. The impenetrable cleaner was finally cracking under the sheer weight of the war. Torin leaned forward, pressing a harsh, desperate kiss to her lips. It was a promise forged in the dirt. I took the fire, he rasped against her mouth. You are my queen. I will never let you fall. Hauling himself upright, they stepped through the smoking, jagged hole. And it opened into the city's forgotten transit lines. The black maw of the subway tunnel stretched ahead, hiding whatever ambush the cartel had waiting in the dark.
Stagnant water and rotting iron filled Harper's lungs as they descended onto the cracked subway tracks. Torrin leaned against her shoulder, his combat boots dragging across the rusted rails. The silver poisoning was tearing his nervous system apart. Despite the venom burning his veins, his grip on his rifle never faltered. Static suddenly hissed from the burner phone strapped to her vest. Harper yanked it free, staring at the intercepted cartel frequency. "Target located in the lower transit grid," a distorted voice crackled through the tiny speaker. "The king is bleeding out. Intercept and eliminate. Capture the cleaner." The syndicate strike team was flanking them. With Torrin bleeding out across the concrete, his scent was a walking beacon. Survival demanded a brutal sacrifice. She had to sever the dead weight, drawing the cartel's fire away from the injured Alpha so he could recover. "Harper, don't," Torrin choked out. He read the exact tactical shift in her eyes. Ignoring his command, she shoved him hard into a shadowed maintenance alcove behind a concrete load-bearing pillar. His legs buckled, sliding down the wet brick wall. "I am a ghost," she whispered, her voice dropping to a dead, hollow pitch. "I can pull their line of sight. If I stay here, they execute us both." "You are my pack," Torrin snarled. His bloody fingers clamped weakly around her wrist. The physical contact sent a jolt of static up her arm. She didn't offer a comforting lie. Bending down, she pressed her lips to his feverish forehead, breathing in his fading scent of pine and ozone one last time. Prying his failing grip off her wrist, Harper turned around. She stepped backward into the pitch-black tunnel, racking the slide of her handgun and walking straight toward the execution squad.
The absolute silence of the subway tunnel pressed against Torrin's eardrums as Harper's shadow dissolved into the gloom. He gritted his teeth, forcing his boots underneath his shifting center of gravity. A king never dies on his knees. The silver embedded in his shoulder tore through muscle fiber with every movement, leaking venom directly into his bloodstream. Dragging his boots across the rusted rails, he followed the fading scent of vanilla and burnt cordite lingering in the stagnant air. He caught up to her at a collapsed maintenance wall. Grabbing her tactical vest, he spun her around. Harper reacted purely on instinct. Her sidearm snapped up, aiming perfectly at his sternum. "I told you to stay," she hissed. Her eyes darted toward the pitch-black shadows beyond his shoulder. Torrin stepped forward. The cold steel barrel pressed directly against his chest. "We are a pack now," he rumbled, his rough voice echoing off the concrete. "You will slow me down," she whispered, her finger tightening on the trigger guard. "I will cover your back," he corrected. She lowered the weapon, the metal slide clicking softly in the quiet. Pushing her gently forward, they navigated the final stretch of the dark tunnel. The freezing night air began to filter through the rusted exit grate, pulling them directly toward the trap waiting in the rail yard.
Freezing wind instantly whipped across Harper's face as they cleared the subway exit, stepping through the chained gates of the abandoned train yard. The sprawling lot reeked of rotting lumber and stale motor oil. Her boots crunched against the loose gravel. Total silence blanketed the grid of decaying boxcars, setting her nerves entirely on edge. A blinding industrial floodlight snapped on. Harper raised her weapon, squinting through the harsh glare. The center of the yard stood completely empty. Instead of her sister, a black burner phone rested on top of a rusted oil drum. Fresh blood dripped from the rim, staining the dirt below. Wind whistled through the empty train cars. The dripping blood hit the gravel with a sickening tap. The phone shrieked. Harper lunged for the device, her knuckles turning white around the plastic casing. "Let her go," she demanded, tasting copper at the back of her throat. Your sister is breathing. Silas's voice sneered through the speaker. Bring me Torin's head in 1 hour. If the king lives, the girl dies. The line went dead. Static buzzed in her ear. She dropped the phone onto the rocks, the plastic cracking on impact. Trapped in an impossible corner, she turned slowly toward Torin. He stood bathed in the harsh light, his golden eyes locked onto hers. Raising the barrel of her handgun, she aimed straight at the chest of the only man she loved.
Gravel crunched beneath Torin's boots as he stared down the barrel of Harper's sidearm. Her wrists trembled uncontrollably. Hot tears cut clean lines through the soot coating her cheeks. He didn't shift into his wolf, nor did he issue an alpha command. Instead, Torin let his knees hit the dirt. The impact sent a fresh jolt of agony through his silver-laced shoulder. He ignored the burn. Reaching up, he curled his bleeding fingers around the suppressor of her pistol. He pulled the weapon closer, lodging the muzzle directly against his own throat. If my death buys her freedom, pull the trigger, he rasped. I trust you. A ragged sob tore through Harper's throat. She stared into his golden irises, searching for hesitation. He offered none, only absolute surrender. Her fingers released the grip. The gun clattered onto the rocks, echoing sharply in the quiet yard. Harper collapsed forward, burying her face in his tactical harness. Torin wrapped his good arm around her shaking frame, anchoring her to the earth while the wind howled around them. Slowly, she pulled back. The terror in her eyes burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. She snatched her weapon off the dirt, racking the slide with a sharp metallic clack. They weren't making a trade tonight. They were going to paint the rail yard red with the traitor's blood.
Wind howled through the rusted skeletons of the rail cars. But Harper couldn't feel the cold. The sobbing broke off, replaced by the abrasive scrape of her sleeve against her dirt-caked cheek. The fragile ghost died in the dirt. Pushing off Torin's chest, she squared her shoulders and turned toward the sprawling maze of shipping containers. She dug into her tactical rig. Pulling out a crumpled, grease-stained map of the transit yard, she slapped it flat against the frozen hood of an abandoned flatbed truck. Torin crowded in behind her. The heat radiating off his body cut through the bitter chill. They have the high ground here. And here, she muttered, tapping the faded paper. She grabbed a grease pen from her pocket, dragging sharp black lines across the grid. And growing up in the lower districts taught her the brutal mechanics of sacrifice. You bleed a pawn to expose the king. Tonight, Silas was the target. You hit the main gates, she ordered, keeping her voice flat and authoritative. Draw the gunfire. I take the rear loading crane. I drop him before he knows I have an angle. Torin didn't argue. He didn't try to shove her into a panic room. He just nodded once, completely accepting the tactical reality. Reaching into her pack, Harper pulled out a tube of black grease paint. She dragged a dark streak across her own cheekbone. Torin's bleeding fingers intercepted her hand. Taking the tube, he methodically painted the camouflage across her forehead. The rough pad of his thumb brushed her skin, grounding her frantic pulse. Trapped in a frozen rail yard, the sheer proximity of his body felt like a live wire. She grabbed the lapel of his ruined jacket. Yanking him down, she crashed her mouth against his. It wasn't a gentle goodbye, it was a violent vow. If they crawled out of this graveyard, they would burn the old hierarchy to ash. Releasing his jacket, she racked the slide of her sidearm and stepped backward into the shadows.
The darkness swallowed Harper instantly, leaving Torin standing alone by the rusted flatbed. He didn't waste time watching her vanish. Digging into his slacks, he yanked out an encrypted satellite phone. His thumb hammered a secure frequency into the keypad. He didn't call the beta chain of command. He bypassed the hierarchy entirely, dialing the Royal Guard directly. "Bring the entire unit to the old train yard," Torin ordered. "Silas is the mole." Static hissed through the receiver before the guard captain confirmed the order. ETA was 5 minutes out. Torin lowered the phone. For decades, the Crown taught him that an alpha carries the violence alone. Relying on anyone else invited death. He had locked a predator in a cage, entirely blind to the lethal partner standing right beside him. Tires screamed on the asphalt outside the perimeter fence. 4 matte black SUVs crashed through the chained gates, skidding sideways across the gravel. 30 armed shifters poured out of the vehicles. The scent of burnt rubber and exhaust flooded the yard. The guards formed a perimeter around Torin. Their yellow eyes darted toward the shadows, confused by the human scent lingering on his clothes. Torin didn't growl or project dominance. He turned toward the rusted shipping container where Harper had just emerged from her scouting perimeter. Reaching out, he grabbed her hand and pulled her directly into the center of the kill squad. "Listen to me." Torin kept his voice dangerously low, but it carried perfectly over the idling engines. "This is Harper, my mate, your queen." The guards froze. Idling exhaust drifted over the gravel, and no one moved a muscle. "She protected this territory from the shadows for 7 years," Torin stated, his gaze locking onto the captain. "He broke the old laws right there in the dirt. I am relinquishing tactical command. You follow her orders. She is the deadliest thing in this city." No one challenged him. The captain bowed his head, accepting the shift in power. Harper didn't hesitate. Standing shoulder to shoulder with the Alpha, she began issuing rapid-fire flanking maneuvers to the strike team. Torin watched her operate. A dark, predatory smirk curled his lip. The trap was set, and the cartel was about to realize they caught a wolf.
Freezing rain violently shook the rusted metal ladder as Harper scaled the rear loading crane. Her torn ribs screamed with every upward pull. The downpour slicked the iron rungs, soaking straight through her combat boots. Hauling herself onto the top platform, she collapsed onto her stomach, the grating bit into her bruised chest. She pushed her sniper rifle over the edge, snapping the bipod into place. Squinting through the thermal scope, she scanned the grid below. Torin and the guard unit were moving into position, slipping between the decaying boxcars like liquid ink. She swept the crosshairs toward the center of the yard. Her lungs locked. A blinding halogen work light illuminated the clearing. Her sister sat bound to a steel chair, shivering violently in the freezing rain. Silas stood directly behind the girl. The traitor held a silver-plated combat knife flush against her throat. Bile surged up Harper's throat. A single millimeter of error meant her sister bled out on the gravel. She shoved the rising panic into a mental vault. Pressing her cheek against the cold synthetic stock of the rifle, she slowed her breathing. Inhale, exhale. She let the crosshairs settle. Below, Torin stepped out of the cover of the boxcars. He walked empty-handed into the glare of the halogen light. "Silas!" Torin's voice echoed across the rail yard, cutting over the howling wind. "I am right here. Let her go." Silas barked a harsh, grating laugh. Confident he held all the cards, the beta stepped slightly to the left, peering around the captive girl to gloat at his king. The movement completely exposed his skull. Static crackled in her earpiece. A fierce, unspoken trust anchored her finger to the trigger guard. "Execute," Harper whispered into her throat mic. Squeezing the trigger, the rifle kicked violently against her shoulder, sending a copper-jacketed round tearing through the rain toward the traitor's head.
A copper-jacketed round split the freezing downpour. Silas's skull snapped backward, the arrogant sneer vanishing from his face before his knees ever hit the gravel. The crack of the sniper rifle rolled across the rail yard a fraction of a second later. Silence swallowed the grid. The rain tapped rhythmically against the rusted oil drums. Syndicate enforcers broke the quiet with shouts of panic, raising their silver-plated rifles blindly into the dark. Torin let the violence take the wheel. Muscle and bone fractured, reshaping in a brutal, biological blur. There was no magic here, just the raw, terrifying genetics of an apex predator taking the field. Dark fur erupted across his expanding spine. He lunged into the blinding halogen light. He didn't fight for a bruised ego. He fought to finish the execution his mate had just started, and the Royal Guard followed his lead. 30 wolves crashed into the cartel line. Metal warped under crushing jaws. Torin ripped an assault rifle from a mercenary's grip, throwing the useless steel into the shadows. Above the chaos, the sniper rifle barked a steady, lethal rhythm. Every muzzle flash from the high crane dropped another threat. Torin felt the cold, tactical ice of Harper's focus pulsing through their bond. Gunfire sputtered and died. Cartel survivors dropped their weapons into the mud, falling to their knees in absolute surrender. Sniffing the air, the stench of corrupt human politics clung to the mercenaries' tactical gear. Southern District lawmakers had backed this play. The war was over. Shifting back to his scarred human form, Torin stood bare in the freezing rain. He tilted his head back, looking up at the rusted crane, waiting for the ghost to descend.
The smoking barrel of the rifle hissed against the freezing rain. Looking through the thermal scope, Harper watched the remaining cartel enforcers hit the mud in surrender. Her little sister sat untouched under the floodlight, her chest heaving with terrified sobs. Abandoning the rifle on the grating, Harper scrambled down the rusted ladder. Her bruised ribs screamed with every frantic drop, but adrenaline drowned the agony. Her boots hit the gravel. She sprinted across the yard. "Mia!" The scream tore up her throat, raw and fractured. The young girl lunged forward, colliding with Harper's chest. They crashed to the freezing gravel. Harper buried her face in her sister's wet hair, smelling rain and cheap cartel soap. The walls holding back her terror finally splintered. She sobbed, digging her fingers into Mia's jacket. Her resilience wasn't about never breaking. It was about surviving the fracture. Shadows shifted at the edge of the light. Torin stood quietly in the downpour, a fresh canvas jacket draped over his shoulders, by the guard captain. He maintained his distance, giving the sisters the oxygen to process their survival. Swiping soot and rain from her eyes, Harper looked up at the king. She didn't need words. A slight nod invited him across the invisible boundary. Torin knelt in the mud, wrapping his long arms around both of them, shielding them from the biting wind. Digging into her tactical pocket, Harper pulled out the black plastic keycard she lifted from the bunker. She pressed it into Torin's palm. He rubbed his thumb over the magnetic strip. "Offshore routing," he rumbled. This accesses the syndicate's holding accounts. The debt wasn't just erased. They owned the cartel's bankroll. Leaning her head against Torin's solid collarbone, Harper listened to the steady, rhythmic thump of his heart. The war in the shadows was done, but the empire they were about to build was just beginning.
It took 3 weeks for the rain to finally wash the cartel's blood from the rail yard. Morning sunlight carved sharp angles across the mahogany table of the royal penthouse. Even though the war was over, the silver scars across Torin's shoulders still pulled tight when he moved. The entire pack council sat rigidly in their leather chairs, expecting a traditional alpha briefing. Instead, the frosted glass doors swung open. Harper strode into the boardroom. She didn't wear ceremonial silk. Clad in tailored black tactical gear, silver throwing knives rested openly against her thighs. The council members stiffened, dipping their chins in reluctant respect. Meet the new head of security, Torin stated, his voice carrying the immovable weight of a natural predator. And your equal queen. Harper didn't defer to the floor. She met the eyes of every shifter in the room, flashing a predator's smile before taking the seat directly at Torin's right hand. Hours later, the penthouse ventilation hummed in the quiet. Stepping into the private training gym, Torin found Harper punishing a leather-heavy bag. Sweat glued her tank top to her ribs, highlighting the angry purple bruising still fading along her torso. The impact of her knuckles against the leather stopped. She turned, chest heaving, dropping her wrapped hands to her sides. A dangerous, untamed challenge burned in her dark eyes. "Sparring, my king?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low purr. Torin tossed his towel onto the bench. He stepped onto the foam mats, closing the distance until the heat of her skin radiated against his chest. "I don't want to fight," he growled, sliding his hands over her ribs with calculated gentleness. "I want to claim you." She jumped, wrapping her legs around his waist. He caught her, driving her back against the padded wall. Their mouths collided. It tasted of salt, sweat, and absolute survival. The king and his lethal ghost had finally carved out a brutal, beautiful peace.